Hello, and welcome to this CAPS Grade 12 Mathematics video series. My name is Chinmay, and in this video series, I'll be tutoring students on all the maths topics they'll cover over the course of their grade 12 year, as well as all the various types of questions they can expect to see in the final Paper 1 and Paper 2 exams. First, a little bit of background about myself. I personally studied the Cambridge High School curriculum, which covers mostly the same content as the NSC or matric system, and in terms of maths even goes a bit beyond grade 12 and covers some of the material you would do in the first year at university. And I know this because I'm currently in the final year of my bachelor's degree in engineering. The final mark I achieved for A-level maths was 94%, and throughout my engineering degree we do a lot of maths courses, which I generally scored well for, getting a 83% in my first year maths course and 89% for my second year maths course. I think in general I find maths a bit enjoyable, and with a bit of effort I can pick it up quite nicely, and therefore I believe I can provide you some value in teaching you some of the tricks and methods I use to make sense of it. From my personal experience, I'll say that maths is one of the easier subjects you'll encounter in your education. And I say this not because I'm any sort of genius. In fact, I'm actually a really slow learner, and it usually takes me a lot of effort to make sense of new ideas. But the main thing that will make you succeed in maths is practice, practice, practice. The phrase practice makes perfect is most true for maths. There's a lot of other subjects where people can use the whole cramming approach, where they just memorize a bunch of things the night before and spit these out in their test the next day, and from this they can somehow pass. But unfortunately, that doesn't work for maths. In maths, the majority of the study effort, or rather the mental effort, is in making sense of a certain concept or logic. To demonstrate this idea of just understanding the logic, I'll give you a simple example of just learning addition. So this is something you probably do in nursery school or early primary school. So before this, you would have learned how to count from 1 to 10, and then they'll present you with this situation. So you normally use some physical object which you're familiar with already, such as an apple, to sort of make it easier to explain. So then you'll be able to count this as 1, 2, 3, this as 1, 2, 3, and this as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So then when learning addition, you'll just be like, okay, if I have 3 like this and 3 like this, I just put them all together and then count them again from the beginning, from 1, then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And once you get that basic idea, you can apply it to more difficult situations, say maybe 5 plus 5 or something 20 plus 5 or something. Like it can keep getting more complicated, but as long as you continue practicing, it becomes easier and easier, and then eventually it becomes almost obvious to you, and you don't really need to think about it when you approach the new situation. And you can often read the explanation of the logic, but until you apply it and see it in action, you won't truly understand it. So what makes maths easy, in my opinion, is that once you understand the basic logic, an exam question will never surprise or trick you, and I think this can be quite comforting. Anyway, enough about that. So the main point is, don't fear maths. Once you practice enough questions, and with a bit of my help, I think it will start to become easy and will actually turn into one of your more comfortable subjects. Coming back to grade 12 maths specifically, it is split up into paper 1 and paper 2. Both of these are made up of 150 marks, and this implies that they have the same weight, or they count equally. So if you want to do well in the subject as a whole, you can't just plan to do really well in one of the papers and do okay in the other. You have to do really well in both of the papers, especially if you want to get above 80 or 90% overall. Now I'll give you an overview of what topics come in each paper, and in general what each paper is about. I think it's useful to see this at an early stage, as it'll give you some idea of how much you need to know before your final exam, and can serve as a guideline for you to plan ahead. First off, here's the topic breakdown for P1. Now, put simply, P1 is mainly about problem solving and the usage of various equations. many of which will be given in the info sheet at the back of the exam paper. So this applies to the patterns and sequences, finance growth and decay, algebra and equations, calculus, and probability sections. Then there's also a bit of a visual or graphing aspect to it where you'll, for example, be given a certain curve and maybe some coordinates, and you'll need to analyze this and extract some sort of information from it. Lastly, you'll most likely need to sketch some sort of graph. Now, let's have a look at the topics that come under P2. So these are all the topics for P2. And I would say P2 is much more based on a whole visual aspect and geometry. And when I say geometry, I mean much less related to things like hyperbole and asymptotes, but much more so to actual shapes. You look at these shapes in two forms. One is plotted on X and Y axes, and the other is just as regular shapes in free space. This paper is quite analytical because you'll need to know various rules related to various shapes. So the shapes mainly being lines, triangles, circles, and quadrilaterals, which are shapes with four sides. In the paper, you'll be given these various shapes in various different arrangements, and they'll test you by seeing how well you're able to apply these various rules you know to these different diagrams. So you'll need to analyze them and say, for example, determine the size of a certain angle or maybe the length of a certain side of a shape. So that's mainly for the whole Euclidean geometry and analytical geometry part. And then for trigonometry and measurement, you'll more specifically focus on angles and sine, cos, and tan. And then lastly, you have the statistics and regression section, which in my opinion is actually the much easier bit because there's not so much analysis and thinking involved. It's mostly just plugging a bunch of numbers into a bunch of equations. You just need to know the specific method of doing certain calculations on your calculator. So once you know the method, it's super easy because then you just plug in the numbers, just press a bunch of buttons, and you get your answer nicely, and then you just put it on your paper. So now that you know what's involved in both of the papers, the next thing that's important to know is the number of marks assigned to each topic in the paper. For P1, it's the following. The number of marks assigned to each topic gives a pretty good idea of how much time you should spend on each of them. There are 150 marks total, spread out over 3 hours or 180 minutes. So if you do the maths, the following is how many minutes you have for each question. It may seem like we're overthinking things here, but it is important to keep a realistic view of things so we can plan how to deal with the restrictions imposed on us, time being the biggest one. For now, I'll say that if you still need to learn the material and practice it for the first time, don't worry so much about these time restrictions. For now, just focus on understanding the logic behind each topic, then practice questions of different difficulty levels till it starts making some sense to you. Clear up any confusions you have by talking to your teachers or looking at worked examples. Then, only when you're making preparations for your tests or exams and you're comfortable with the material, start to think about how to manage the time you have available to you. When you're at that stage, I suggest come back to this video and watch the following section on time management. Otherwise, I'd recommend just pause the video for now and continue with the rest of the course videos, as it will probably just be too much information too soon. If you're interested in a time management strategy you can use for your exams, let us continue. Working in line with trying to manage the time you have available, you can go even a little further to ensure you are able to finish everything on time. So starting off, these numbers are calculated assuming you'll be doing nothing else but working on these questions for the entire 3 hours of the exam. This is a bit unrealistic because generally the best thing to do once you open your exam paper is to briefly scan all the questions that are there in the paper. So this can take anywhere from say 2 to 10 minutes, and we haven't accounted for this yet. Then maybe account another 5 minutes for say a quick break to the loo. Lastly, account 10 to 15 minutes for quick recheck at the end, just to ensure that you've answered everything to the best of your ability and are happy with the exam you'll be handing in. Adding all these amounts together gives 30 minutes, leaving you with 2.5 hours or 150 minutes for 150 marks. This is a nice coincidence because you can then think of it as 1 mark per minute. Adjusting for this gives you, I've titled it as O, as in the optimal timing. It's nothing really new, it's just pretty much the exact same as this one. So it's worth keeping in mind that this calculation is a worst case scenario. So in all likelihood, you'll have slightly more time than this for each question. And I say this because, for one, you won't necessarily go to the loo. 2, you'll probably take less time for the initial scan through the paper, say maybe 5 minutes only. 3, your recheck at the end could just take 5 minutes if, for example, you answered everything perfectly on the first try and didn't leave out any questions. Lastly, you answer some questions, those you're more comfortable with, quicker than the times calculated over here. Because, as earlier said, this is a worst case scenario. In general, working and planning for the worst case scenario keeps you best prepared for any situation. All in all, if you work in practice towards this rate of 1 mark a minute, you are bound to have tremendous success in your final exam. Lastly, if you apply this whole logic to paper 2 as well, you get the following. I know this all looks quite a bit messy, so I'll put it all in a single nice, neat table, and I'll include this in the course resources as well. Finally, to summarize this pretty long video, the key things to keep in mind are, first and foremost, maths is doable. All it takes is a little practice. And on that note, practice, practice, practice. Third, the most effort you need to put is in understanding the main solving logic. After that, it's just practice. Fourth, timing is critical. Timing both in terms of the amount of time you have available to work on an exam paper, which is 3 hours, but also in terms of the amount of time left between now and when you write your exam. There's quite a lot of work left to do, but as long as you spread it evenly across the time you have left, it's definitely doable. Once you're comfortable with the material and feel ready to practice for the exam, first start off assuming 3 hours available to work on all the questions. That's a good starting point. Once you've practiced a few past exams and have a better feel for time, start to work closer towards the optimal timings as summarized in the tables earlier, which you can find right now under the resources. Lastly, now that you've enrolled in this course and have watched the introductory video, it shows you've already put in some initiative towards doing well in your maths. So let's begin, do a bit of work, and go forth and kill your maths exam this year. Best of luck.